So, hello everybody. Climate sustainability and direct democracy is the header of this track of more sustainable transport concepts and the protection of species and plants. Direct democracy and citizens' council.
Alfred, we can't hear
you. Citizens are pushing. You don't hear me?
No, no.
Here it's green and it's, I don't know. I'm unmuted.
Yes, Alfred, it seems like your connection is really bad.
Yeah, I hear you perfectly, but I see me and I'm unmuted, so I can't change anything right away, I think.
But right now we'll listen you. We can hear you. So maybe just making like your introduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want me to restart or?
Please.
Please. So you hear me now?
Yes, I hope
okay.
So. If not,
so hello.
I'm going to write you.
Okay. So hello everybody, and. Climate. Sustainability and direct democracy through direct democracy and citizens' council, citizens are pushing these concepts forward. For the Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy, we have brought together some of the most impressive examples global problems like climate change. So I give the word to John and we'll get more to answer this question.
Thank you, Alfred. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes? Okay, great. Well, I've got I'm sorry to let you know that I've got a PowerPoint presentation to offer you, which, because there's quite a lot of information and it's probably better I follow that process, otherwise it will become a bit chaotic. So I need to share my screen and let's hope this works. So I need to find what I want to share. Can you see that, my PowerPoint? Can you see that? Dana, can you?
Yes, I can see that.
Yes, John, we see your PowerPoint.
Lovely. Okay, so if I then go to slideshow, and then we can start. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this session, and thank you to the Online Democracy, to the forum for inviting me to speak today about the Simultaneous Policy campaign. Let's get started. As we all know, there are lots and lots of global issues: climate change, there's corporate power, there's global pandemics, there's wealth inequality, there is tax havens, there is nuclear weapons. There are many, many global problems that confront us today. But I'd just like to make a provocative statement that national direct democracy can't solve them. If these problems are global, it should be clear that national action is very, very limited. We need much more transnational action if we're going to solve these problems. So my question really is, what is actually more fundamental? Is it democracy or is it cooperation? Because if you think about it, if we think about it, democracy actually depends on cooperation. Cooperation is really the foundation on which we then build the type of governance that we are going to choose. Democracy being just one option. And of course, not all countries are democratic. China, for example, and there are many others, are not democratic. And so if we want to solve global problems, we need a framework which is much more encompassing and flexible. So cooperation must come first, and maybe then democracy comes later. And as I say, we need a framework that leverages the opportunities that we have in democratic nations, but that is also flexible enough to include non-democratic nations. But there's just one key problem, one key barrier to cooperation in the world today. And it's a phenomenon I call destructive global competition. And I think it's actually quite nicely expressed in this little cartoon image here. Can you see the little image of the runners trying to cross the finish line? Yeah. So what you see here is the first one is actually cutting his throat. Okay. So what this means is that if we take any problem like climate change, for example, to solve climate change, governments would have to impose tighter regulations on their companies, higher taxes on carbon emissions. But any country that does that in advance of other countries, any country that moves first, is going to harm its economy. Okay? So, because that will make the costs of its businesses higher, that will make them less competitive with businesses in other countries, and that will mean jobs being lost, possibly the businesses moving their operations elsewhere to avoid the higher taxes, and nothing much will change. So no government wants to move first. And of course, then you see the number 2 guy here coming up next. He's got his finger in his mouth because he's thinking, well, God, I don't want to go there either, right? So we have this vicious circle where no government wants to move first. And this isn't just the case with climate change. If you think about it, it's the same problem with every global problem we want to think about. So if it's nuclear weapons, well, we can't reduce our stockpile of nuclear weapons unless the other guy does it, because if we go first, we're going to lose. We're going to make ourselves more vulnerable. If it's a case of selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, it's the same discussion. Well, if we in England don't sell jets to Saudi Arabia, well, the French will do it instead, and then we'll lose those jobs to France, and Saudi Arabia will still get the weapons. So this dynamic is, what I'm trying to say is actually the central barrier to solving global problems, whether it's climate change or anything else. And you can see, if you look carefully, you can see examples of this in the newspapers. Here's an extract from an article in the Financial Times about climate change. Governments remain reluctant to address this threat because any country acting alone to curb its greenhouse gas emissions without similar commitments by other governments risks damaging the competitiveness of its industries. So you see, this is how you can find the evidence for the vicious circle of destructive global competition. It's there in the newspapers if we care to look. Excuse me. So there's really a fundamental dilemma that faces every government. It really has a choice. It can either go for economic growth and competitiveness, keeping its national economy competitive, or it can prioritize society and the environment, but it can't do both. And obviously, because supporting society and the environment means higher costs for business. And no government can implement those higher costs because they fear losing competitiveness to economies elsewhere. And actually, it's interesting, sorry, just as a slightly aside issue to this, I don't know if you've been following the Brexit negotiations between Britain and the EU, but it's now coming down to the real critical stuff. And what is that stuff all about? It's about the level playing field. In other words, it's about competitiveness, right? So you can see when all the talking is finished, what this comes down to is level playing field, economic competitiveness, who is going to get an advantage over who. But the problem really, as far as global problems, as solving global problems is concerned, is that this dilemma means that it's not that governments don't want to solve global problems, it's that they can't, right? They are caught in this vicious circle. And whatever politicians, of course, will tell you that what they are doing will solve these problems, but actually they really can't do it. And if you look back over the last 40 years or so, this is the reality. This is why nothing is changing, or it's only changing very, very slowly. And it's changing only very slowly because governments, because they fear losing competitiveness, they can maybe cut their emissions only by a relatively small amount. But we know we need the really big cuts. We don't need an 8% cut in emissions, we need an 80% cut in emissions. And so unless this dilemma, this vicious circle of destructive competition, unless it is broken, we will not solve these problems. Governments are really not able to solve them. Excuse me, just have a drink. So what do we need to do to drive governments to cooperate? Well, the first thing we need is a framework that makes action in each nation's immediate self-interest. Because as you saw, the problem with destructive global competition is that moving first is in every nation's, is the opposite. It's in every nation's interest not to do it. So we have to turn that round. And there are a number of things we need. So first of all, we need the implementation of agreements on emissions and so forth to be implemented simultaneously by all or sufficient nations. Because only with simultaneous implementation do we break that vicious circle, and then all nations can win. Secondly, we need policies that cover multiple global issues. One of the reasons that the United Nations process is failing is because typically they are dealing with just one issue at a time. For example, in terms of climate change, they're talking about emissions cuts. That's the single issue. But if you take almost any single issue, there will always be some nations that win and others that lose. And the losers, of course, then have no incentive to cooperate. So, for example, one of the biggest emitters of carbon, as we know, is the USA. It would, of course, have the largest, the biggest cuts to make. It would therefore have the highest costs to make them. And then why are we surprised that Donald Trump pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement? Because it's not in their interests to cooperate. And we shouldn't just blame Donald Trump, because let's face it, no other government is really doing everything it should either. So, you know, this vicious circle of destructive competition is holding everybody back. But if we had, whoops, sorry, forget about number 3, just coming back to the multiple issues, if you have a negotiation on 2 issues side by side, so for example, you'd have a climate agreement, but alongside it, you might have a global wealth tax or a global currency transactions tax. And then the revenues that you earn from the tax could then be redistributed to governments to compensate them for the cost of cutting their carbon emissions. So if you have a multi-issue policy negotiation, you have a much higher chance of making immediate action in every nation's self-interest. The third point is, right now, we're just talking about targets. Well, we all agree a target to keep emissions down to 1.5 degrees of temperature increase. The problem with targets is that each nation doesn't know what the other nations are going to do to achieve those targets. Okay, so if each nation is highly uncertain, because if it implements certain regulations which will make costs higher for some of its industries, it doesn't know whether its competitor nations are going to be doing the same thing. So this uncertainty doesn't help. So targets are useful, but what we need is detailed policies so that every nation knows precisely what every other nation is going to do. And finally, our national governments are not going to find their way out of this vicious circle by themselves. So we citizens need to drive the process. So that's where the direct democracy side of Simpol comes in, and I'll come back to that later. So Simpol is really, the Simultaneous Policy is a campaign that's designed to achieve that, to provide that framework that makes immediate action in every nation's self-interest. And what I'd like to talk about is what I call the 3 Ps. There are 3 aspects of Simpol: the policy, the pledge, and the process. So let's quickly talk about Simpol as a policy, first of all. So the first thing, as I said, the idea is that whatever the policy is, or the policies are, would be implemented by all sufficient nations simultaneously, because in that way you break the vicious circle of destructive global competition. Secondly, the policies that would be included in Simpol are only those policies that nations can't implement alone. Okay, so we're not talking about any kind of national or local or policies, you know, that individual nations can implement alone. We're only talking about those that they can't implement alone. So that's important, because Simpol doesn't encroach on national sovereignty. It only helps nations to deal with those issues that no nation can deal with alone. Also, we're not suggesting that all global problems would be solved simultaneously on one day. That would be crazy. What we're talking about is a series of multi-issue policy packages or multi-issue global agreements. So, for example, you might have Simpol 1 in year 1, Simpol 2 in year 3, Simpol 3 in year 5, and so forth. So it would be a series of multi-issue agreements. And as I said, the content of those agreements would be strongly influenced by citizens, and I'll explain why and how that would work. Also, the policies would not be one size fits all. One of the big fears about global cooperation is every nation having to do exactly the same thing. No, Simpol would not be a one size fits all. So, for example, if one of the agreements under Simpol was an increase in corporation tax globally, that doesn't mean the rate of corporation tax would be the same for every country. What it might mean is that every country agrees to increase their level of corporation tax by a certain agreed percentage. So you keep a graduation, a different, a little bit like in an individual country, you have progressive taxation where the rich pay a higher amount of tax, or they're supposed to, and the poor pay less or nothing at all. You'd have the same thing, but just globally, where different nations are treated in an appropriate way, but differently, but within the framework of the simultaneous implementation agreement. And negotiations on the actual content, the policy content of Simpol, would only take place once sufficient nations had signed the Simpol pledge. So that's the second P that I want to talk about, is the pledge. So what is that pledge? So first of all, the pledge is a commitment to be signed by individual members of parliament, by political parties, and by governments. And the pledge is really a one-page document. You can look at it on our website, but essentially what it says is, I pledge to implement the simultaneous policy only if all the sufficient nations have also signed the pledge and if the policy content of Simpol has been agreed. Okay, so it's really very much a pledge in principle. And that's important because there's no point trying to design a policy to solve global problems until you've got everybody in the room, all nations or sufficient nations into the room in principle to actually then thrash out what the policy content of the agreement is going to be. So the idea of Simpol at this stage in getting politicians and parties and governments to sign the pledge is to build international trust and confidence. It's a little bit like getting governments to say, yes, I will if you will. I'm ready to talk about this. I'm ready to come into the room to negotiate the simultaneous policy if you are. And I'm ready to implement it if and when you are too. Okay, so there's a sort of reciprocity going on. Now let's move on to the really interesting bit, which is the process, the third P. How do we actually get this to happen? And how do citizens play a role? And it's very, very simple. Because when you sign up to Simpol as a citizen, all you're doing is you're saying, I will give strong voting preference to politicians or parties who've signed the Simpol pledge. It's very simple. What does that mean? It means, therefore, that politicians and parties who sign the pledge gain an electoral advantage. They're more likely to receive your vote if they sign the pledge than if they don't. And this creates a powerful domino effect. Because if you think about it from the point of view of a politician or a government or a political party, there is no disadvantage to signing the pledge. Why? Because the pledge only gets implemented if and when all sufficient nations are on board. Until then, a politician or party can follow their current policies unchanged. So there's no downside, there's no disadvantage to signing. There's only an advantage. The advantage is to gain those extra votes of Simpol supporters. But there is a downside if you're a politician and your competitor has signed the pledge. If you don't sign it, you could lose out. So this often creates, particularly in electoral areas which are being won and lost on very small numbers of voters, it creates a domino effect. So when one candidate signs up at an election, then the next one signs up, and then the next one, and then the next one. And I'll explain how this has happened quite a few times in past elections. The other thing you might think is, yes, well, you know, politicians might sign the pledge before an election in order to get a better chance of gaining your vote, but then they'll just ignore it or cancel it after the election. But if you think about it, that doesn't make any sense at all, because a politician doesn't actually have to implement the simultaneous policy until all or sufficient nations are on board. So if he or she was to cancel their vote or their pledge, sorry, if they were to cancel their pledge at any point up until the implementation of Simpol, it would just be like saying to their voters, don't trust me, please don't vote for me ever again. And the bigger the citizen support for Simpol becomes, the more impossible it is going to become for politicians to cancel their commitment. The other point is, of course, this works in democratic countries. So how are we going to get non-democratic countries to join this process? Well, the answer to that is that we don't know, but the answer is that the framework that I described for Simpol, simultaneous implementation, multi-issue policy agenda, means that there is really nothing to lose for non-democratic nations to join the process and everything to gain, because as global problems get worse and worse, they too are going to need a solution. And if the United Nations process continues to fail, then the Simpol process could start to become the only game in town. We'll have to see. But the idea is that non-democratic nations would simply join the process voluntarily. And so the point here is that it's we citizens, by supporting the simultaneous policy, by joining the campaign, we are driving politicians towards global cooperation. So you could say that Simpol is a kind of emerging citizens' assembly, but it's one with teeth, because it's engaging our right to vote. By using our right to vote to drive politicians towards cooperation, we have the power not only to drive them in that direction, but also to decide what the policy content of Simpol should be. And that's where the direct democracy side comes in. So we are not asking politicians, we are compelling them. Let me just come back to the domino effect that I mentioned earlier, just to show you in a very practical way how this worked. What you're seeing on the screen now is a screenshot from our previous website that we had in about 5 years ago during the general election in the UK. And what you're seeing here, you see Vale of Clwyd, which is one constituency in Wales, which was very marginal. In other words, it was the support between the main Labour and Conservative was very, very tight. It was hanging on about 100 votes, something like that. And what you can see here is, first of all, on the 14th of May, we got the Liberal Democrat, Gwyn Williams, signed the pledge, right? So at that point, we then sent a nice little email to his competitors saying, hey, your competitor just signed the pledge. Why put yourself at a disadvantage? You should be signing the pledge too. Otherwise, our voters will be more inclined to vote for Gwyn Williams because he signed the pledge. A few days later, what happened? Chris Ruane, the Labour candidate, he signed up, right? So then we had two of them had signed up. And then finally, the sitting MP actually at the time was James Davies, the Conservative. And I think the election was on the 21st of May. So the day before, he finally signed up because he thought, damn it, if I don't sign and there's more Simpol supporters in my area than I realized, I could lose my seat. So he signed up too, right? So in the end, we had all three main candidates signing the pledge. So whoever won, we won. Whoever wins, Simpol wins, okay? So this is what I mean by the domino effect. And we've seen this happen on a number of occasions, particularly in what we call marginal, very tightly contested seats. And if you think about it, if you look around the world these days, the polarization that we're seeing between Republicans and Democrats, Labour and Conservative, whatever, you know, we're seeing it all over the world where this polarization means that the number of voters that you would need just to tip the balance one way or the other is becoming smaller and smaller. And it's exactly that balance that Simpol exploits. And that's why Simpol doesn't need a majority to be successful. It just needs the critical number. So what have our results been so far? So in the UK, at the last general election in 2019 in December, we got over 700 candidates from right across the party political spectrum to sign the pledge. And of those, we now have over 100 pledged MPs in the UK Parliament. So that's Greens, Liberal Democrats, Scottish Nationalists, Labour, and some Conservatives as well. So we have, I don't know, that's probably about 12, 13, 14% of the members of Parliament of the UK Parliament are now pledged to implement the simultaneous policy. And yet the number of UK supporters that we have is relatively small. It's just a few thousand. Okay, so you can see the leverage potential is enormous. Now, of course, the UK electoral system is very advantageous for the kind of process that I've described. But what we've discovered is that we've also done quite well in proportional representation countries like Ireland and Germany. In Ireland earlier this year, we got 53 candidates to sign the pledge, and 17 of those are now members of the Dáil, the Irish Parliament. And in Germany at the last election of the Bundestag, we got 50 candidates to sign, and 11 of those are now members of the Deutsche Bundestag. And we have also some pledged members of Parliament in the European Parliament, in Australia, Luxembourg, and Argentina. And actually today, we got, just today, our very first member of Parliament in the Danish Parliament as well. So the process is beginning to roll, but of course we need it to roll much faster and much quicker, and that's why we need support from citizens all over the world. The other thing I want to just wrap up with is to try to put Simpol or global cooperation in an evolutionary context. If we zoom out and think about the whole of human evolution and the evolution of cooperation and governance throughout human history, we started with hunter-gatherer bands and tribes. That then progressed to larger city-states or middle-aged small states. That then progressed to still larger nation-states. But what has driven this continual expansion in the scale of governance? Well, the simple answer is technology. Because what happens is new technologies change the context for governance. So when hunter-gatherer tribes started farming, and because of farming, grain and seeds and food could be stored over longer periods. It allowed communities to become settled in villages and eventually cities. That meant that the scale of governance had to change. You couldn't have the tribal chief running a small city anymore. You know, so governance had to expand because of the new technology that was driving it. And then in the Middle Ages, the governance imposed by the Catholic Church in Europe and the influence of religion, once the technology of printing came along and knowledge became democratized, knowledge was no longer in the hands of the church. It became democratized amongst the people through printing. Of course, religious governance couldn't last. And so that had to move to the nation state. The nation state then became the next level, the next higher level, higher, more encompassing, larger level of cooperative governance. And where are we today? We now have internet technology. We now have global technology, which is undermining national governments. That's destructive global competition has been brought about by globalization. And so what's next? What's next is some kind of global level cooperative governance. That's where evolution is asking humanity to go. And Simpol is really just one option for how we might get there. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much indeed. I would urge you, please, to sign on to the campaign. It just takes a couple of minutes. You can do it at simpol.org. It's completely free. We've got campaigns running in a number of countries, but we need more. So wherever you are, if you are interested in just signing up, or if you're interested in actually becoming more active and in helping us in your country where we haven't got a campaign going yet, we'd be delighted to hear from you. So thank you very much indeed. And now we can have lots of, I hope, lots of questions.
Yeah, there was already a chat. First of all, thanks a lot. Africa, are you back? Can you hear us? So if not, I'm just going to ask the question of Heiko Erhard. You said, you talked about sufficient parties. What does it mean in particular? Who defines what is sufficient and what is not sufficient?
Good question. I mean, it depends, basically. It depends on, sufficient is however many nations is needed to ensure that the cooperation can proceed without the risk of free-riding nations. You understand what I mean? In other words, so for example, if we were talking about a policy on eliminating nuclear weapons, that would have to include all nations that possess nuclear weapons, but also those that are suspected of possessing nuclear weapons. But that number is not 200, that's maybe just, I don't know how many nations, is that 20 nations, maybe something like that. On the other hand, if you're talking about something like corporation tax, that would probably require just about all nations. So the number of how many nations are sufficient depends on the precise policy area that we're talking about. And what one would have to do in when it came down to the negotiations would be to try and match these policy packages so that the number of nations needed, for each, for a nuclear weapons agreement, for example, would be matched with the other policy in that package. So it would be complex, but the short answer is it depends on the policy we're talking about.
So now there's Lucy Kirchlin. I'm sorry if I.
Lucy Kirchlin. Hello.
Kirchlin, I'm really sorry.
Thank you for the session. Thank you very much, John, for a really clear and insightful presentation. Very helpful, although I'm familiar with Simpol. I actually have a question regarding the sort of accountability mechanism, or rather the sort of transmission of citizens' vote, citizens, interests into policy action, because it just seems to me, it's very, I mean, it's clear that the process that you describe, but it just seems to me to be very indirect. Citizens elect politicians, politicians sign up to a pledge, but that pledge then only maybe gets implemented if sufficient other governments are on board and agree. And it just seems to me that it's a very, very weak pledge, or put differently, it's a very weak accountability mechanism through which citizens who elect politicians, usually every 4 years, usually, you know, it's within a force field of other interests and other relationships as well. And I was just wondering how you see that connection between kind of me as a citizen voting for an MP who has signed up to the pledge, and actually me being able to, you know, ask for accountability and put more pressure on them to actually do as they're told, and also to speed up government action, because it's easy for a government to make the right noises, but as we know, you know, they're not really moving, even if their feet are being roasted, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of points you're raising there, Lucy. Thanks for the question. First of all, when a politician signs the pledge, or a party, they sign it for life. Okay, they don't, it doesn't last just for that election. So an MP that signs the pledge, he signs it for life, and unless and until he were to write to us to cancel it, which no politician ever has. And so what that means is that from election, so Simpol builds from election to election. So for example, at the last UK election, when the election was called, there were already quite a large number of candidates who had already signed up back in 2017. Okay, so the point about Simpol is that the momentum builds from election to election. Okay, so that means that for citizens, if you sign on, that pressure that you're applying doesn't stop at election. You know, at one election, it carries on ad infinitum. It carries on into the future, and as the numbers of supporters grows, that means that pressure, that compulsion on politicians to sign up only gets bigger and bigger. And of course, as global problems worsen, the pressure increases only even more. Now, in terms of the actual policies, the way that would work, or the way I would envisage it, would be that if and when we got to a point where, you know, there were, let's say, quite a number of governments had already been driven to sign up to Simpol, what one would do, a policy development process would be kicked off in each country. And to begin with, that would be just a national process in each country to take into account the policy priorities of each individual nation and the Simpol supporters in that nation. Okay, so this is not a policy development process that would involve politicians. It would involve purely citizens that support Simpol. Okay, we would determine what the policies would be. We might not do that by ourselves. We might invite think tanks, or we might invite universities or policy specialists to advise us. You know, that would be for Simpol supporters to decide. But the point is that we would be determining the policy content, and then our votes, of course, make it compulsory on the politicians to implement those policies, because if they deviate, they lose our vote, and then their competitor will get it instead. The second stage of the process would then be an international negotiation between the representatives of Simpol supporters in each country and with the governments of non-democratic countries to see if an agreement can be thrashed out. And obviously by that time, you can, one is, using a lot of imagination to think about that. But I think that the point is that, that sounds quite fantastical when we look at it from today's perspective. But I think if we imagine a situation where, nations are stuck in this vicious circle, they haven't got the consciousness or the ability to even realize that they're stuck in a vicious circle. The United Nations has a process which unfortunately is deeply flawed. And we have this Simpol process which seems albeit in a very small way at the moment, to be able to engage citizens and politicians right across the party political spectrum, from across different countries, different electoral systems, and to be starting to get this ball rolling. So who knows? I mean, you know, I'm not saying that this is exactly how it will unfold. What I'm saying is this is one way it could unfold. And if you, in fact, if you go onto the policy page of our website, there's a download there called the Information Pack. And that gives you a much more detailed explanation of how we would envisage this process of policy development taking place and how governments would be driven to adopt it. So if you download the Information Pack, that will give you answers on everything, actually, in much more detail. But I hope that's answered to some degree, at least.
So next, Daniel Fred wanted to ask something. Wait a second. You're still on mute.
There we go. Hi, everyone.
Now.
Yeah, I'm going to be on the ballot here in Thousand Oaks in November. So if you have any people that might want to support a dark horse candidate that's keeping the money out of politics by not raising or spending any. But I'm getting ideas out there, like, you know, I'm a ham radio operator and a CERT trained, you know, emergency responder. But I guess what I would ask is, could this work at the city municipal level and even at the individual level? Like, could people take a pledge saying, I'm not going to initiate force or fraud against my fellow human? And, you know, actually, I would be bound by that. I wouldn't even need a contingency agreement to be bound by that. But that would be just a nice way of getting the non-aggression principle out there, which is something the Libertarian Party actually uses if you want to join the Libertarian movement. You agree not to initiate force or fraud.
Yeah, Daniel, good question. I mean, the principle could be used at all sorts of levels, right? So, you know, you could imagine, I don't know, in a local town, if citizens were like desperate to have a public swimming pool or something, you know, you could start a pledge, you know, saying, you know, I'll vote for any politician within reason that pledges to give us a swimming pool. You know, so I mean, you could use the principle that, you know, the mechanism that we're advocating at all sorts of levels, as far as Simpol is concerned, we just restrict it purely to the global level, because for us, you know, that's where humanity is missing. You know, that's the level we're all missing at the moment. You know, is we've got the local level, we've got the national level, you know, we've got, you know, regional levels, some, you know, with the European Union, and we've got some of the you know, Mercosur and ASEAN and so forth. But what we haven't got is the global level. And unfortunately, the United Nations is, you know, through no fault of its own, is unable to really meet that requirement. And so while the principle of Simpol could be used at different levels, Daniel, you're right, we are just focusing just on that global level of any global problem that suffers from this prisoner's dilemma problem, you know, this problem of destructive global competition.
Well, maybe there's a room to expand it, but yeah, I agree. Keep the focus narrow so you can have maximum effectiveness. But maybe this could be kind of a grassroots expansion suggestion for the idea.
So next, Heiko Erhard wants to ask a question.
Okay, thank you. I need some clarification. So I see Simpol as some kind of strategy to actually to synchronize participant going for a common goal. So when you talked, when you showed that slide where many people having signed Simpol in different countries. So what content are we talking about? I mean, I guess this is not the same thing that they have signed. So I see that a little bit similar to a crowdfunding thing. So crowdfunding, same idea, you get all or you get nothing. But actually crowdfunding is actually the actual mechanism, but the individual crowdfunding campaign is about a particular thing. So which are basically the use cases that you have addressed using Simpol so far?
Well, all of the politicians who've signed, they have all signed the same thing. They've all signed the same pledge, right? But we haven't been able to solve any problems in practice yet, because of course we need all or sufficient nations to be on board. So I can't give you any example of Simpol actually solving a global problem so far, because we haven't yet got the necessary level of international cooperation for that to happen. So was that your question, Heiko? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, I guess so. My question when I hear that, maybe you want to try local first before going global.
Well,
in order
I would say that, you know, that's already been tried and tested.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. I don't know if you're a smoker. I'm not a smoker, but you know, if you want to ban smoking in your house, you implement that globally in the sense of applying to the whole house, to every room, and you implement it simultaneously as the parents. You ban smoking globally and simultaneously, not in one room you can smoke, but not in another, and so forth. So and give you another example, when Sweden changed from driving on the left to driving on the right back in 1966, I think, or I can't quite remember, 62 maybe, it was implemented globally and to the entire Swedish territory and simultaneously at 6 o'clock in the morning, right? Why? Because you can imagine if it wasn't global and simultaneous, you would have a lot of car repair shops making a hell of a lot of money from car accidents, you know. So what I'm saying is the principle of global and simultaneous implementation has been tried and tested and found to be successful. You know, I mean, every time a national government passes a law, it is implemented globally in the sense of covering the entire territory, and it comes into force simultaneously on a certain date. So, and in fact, even in that there are many evolutionary biologists that are actually quite interested in Simpol, because in fact in evolution, not just of human evolution, but evolution generally, global and simultaneous implementation has in fact proven to be a key means of breaking competition bottlenecks. So, you know, I think that the proof has already, at lower levels, is already all around us if we care to look. But where humanity has never done this before is at the global level. And that's the challenge. We've never done it before, but we God as hell need to do it now.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I really like the idea, but my question is, if as a politician I would say, I want to sign Simpol now, what do I sign?
Well, you sign the pledge. So
pledge
if you go
for
website,
what?
You have the full pledge, but it is just, like I said, it is just a pledge in principle.
Okay.
You know, because you know you won't. you know, that, and it's like Lucy said, it sounds like a terribly weak pledge. It sounds terribly weak. But if you think about it, the more support grows, the stronger it becomes, because the stronger our support, the less options politicians have to wriggle out of the pledge, because their votes depend on it, right? So it's I don't know, it's a little bit like, sometimes it's sort of like a little, you could say it looks like a tiny little fish, and it goes down the throat of a politician. But as our support for Simpol grows, that fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it can't come out anymore, right? So it looks like a very low, very weak pledge, but actually, as support grows, it gets more and more powerful.
I mean, the pledge reads actually, I pledge to implement the Simpol only if all or sufficient nations have also signed the pledge and if the policy content has been agreed. So, I mean, I would be careful signing that if I do not know what will it be about, what will be actually the future topic that we are talking about. I would not give actually a kind of blanco in that way.
Well, we find that politicians are quite happy to sign it, and mainly because I think they can see that you know, that ultimately if they choose not to agree with the policies, they could in principle pull out. So it doesn't irrevocably commit them if they absolutely wanted to cancel. But I think the point is that as global problems get worse and worse and worse, the pressure for cooperation increases, and also the nature of the problems becomes clearer and clearer. So I think that although today it may seem difficult to determine, well, what would the exact policy content of Simpol be, by the time, you know, as global problems become more serious, even more serious, it becomes easier to see what the policies should be. So at the moment, what we list on our website is really a series of global issues: climate change, dealing with global health pandemics, wealth inequality, nuclear weapons, corporate tax avoidance, and so forth, financial market regulation, that kind of thing. We list the broad issues. But I think the policies, the precise policies, will become clearer and clearer. It's a process that needs to be developed. And I mean, you know, what politicians see, they seem to be, I think you see the problem, Heiko, is if we said, well, this is the simultaneous policy, if we tried to decide the policies now, not only would that be undemocratic, it would also be possibly quite inappropriate for the state of the world in 10 or 20 years' time, when the date for implementation arrived. You know, so this has to be an evolving participative process, I think. And there is a lot of uncertainty in it. I mean, that is true. Will it work? I don't know. But, you know, do we have, I mean, you know, my approach really is not to, I don't think, oh, you know, Simpol is fantastic and it's perfect and it will work. I'm just saying, do we have a better idea? You know, it's not a question of it will work. It's, you know, we are sadly in a state where there are no certainties, you know. You know, life is messy. There are no guarantees. So it's that kind of spirit that we're actually trying to encourage citizens and politicians to engage in. And like I say, I mean, what we generally find actually is that politicians, I think, because they are the ones that are caught on the horns of the you know, of this competitiveness dilemma, they are actually quite relieved. We got some really nice comments from politicians who were saying, you know, thank you for such an imaginative initiative, which really solves a lot of our dilemmas, you know. So let's see, I would say.
Okay, so the whole thing is really about committing myself to a particular process, to a particular way of handling things.
Yes.
Okay, this makes sense. Now
Yeah,
I understand it better. Yeah.
Okay, Heike, yeah, sorry. And I mean, I would also say, you know, don't just commit yourself to Simpol, you know, commit yourself to any of the really top initiatives, global initiatives out there, including the United Nations. You know, we shouldn't just back one horse, we should back all of the best horses.
So John, there are like more questions, I hope it's okay. But Daniel Schilly asked that he was really impressed how the EU has been smoking with simultaneous policies. Is the EU not one of the successful Simpol organizations?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that, Dana.
Yeah,
So
maybe I can explain it. So, well, I think it would be not fair to focus. What you essentially said, as I understood it now, is that it's good to work together globally and to be somehow unite in good ideas, and then feel that it's great to get rid of some of the really essential problems we have. But on the other hand, of course, if we discuss, it's always a good thing to tackle a person a little bit. So my question is at the end, don't we have already very good organization, very strong, simple organizations like the EU? Shouldn't we bring the EU more together as one first step of a very effective, simple policy? So, for example, also environmental questions, you know, the flora, fauna, habitat rules. If you destroy nature, then there's this point system where you have to, if you build a house, you have to apply. So I think it's of course the EU is not ideal, but I think it's a great example of the messy human way to work together. Don't you agree?
Well, yes, in one sense, Daniel, I do. I mean, any example of governance at any level is an example of simultaneous action, if you like. However, I think the difficulty today, and I think this is one of the reasons why the EU and nations themselves are under such pressure and there is such polarization, is precisely because we already have a global economy with capital moving globally, but we only have governance at a national or EU level. And so that imbalance means that even the European Union is vulnerable to global markets. So, for example, one of the reasons there is so much, you know, we've had Brexit. Why? Partly because corporations want cheap labor. Corporations want cheap labor, so they are encouraging governments to have very easy migration, excuse me. You know, allowing immigrants to come, you know, to come in. And then, of course, you get a backlash from the indigenous population who feel that their cultural identity is under threat. Now, you see, the point is the European Union is an example, but we are already in a global market. And you cannot, any governance structure that is smaller than global cannot ultimately survive. And what we're seeing with the European Union is the beginning of that fragmentation. And that's why we've got to go, in my view, I don't think the European Union will be a stepping stone. It's an example, as every example of government is an example of Simpol. But we've got to go more directly to the global level because the economy is already global. You know, we just don't have the time to do stepping stones. And so that, you know, I'm not a Brexiteer. Just to make it clear, Daniel, I voted to stay in the European Union, and I would support it. But I think that we need this rise of the far right everywhere is a reaction to the negative fallouts of a global market that doesn't yet have governance and cooperation on the same level. And that it's that level that we need to, it's that gap that we need to close. It seems to me anyway.
So next, there's a question from Joe Matthews.
My apologies. There's work is beginning here in Los Angeles. My question was about what you make of. I don't know if you looked at the World Citizens Initiative and what you make of it, since it's an attempt to create an initiative tool, direct democracy tool for the whole world.
Joe, sorry, there's some interference there on your line.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So maybe I'm going to read out loud what he wrote in the comments. Tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. there's a panel on the World Citizens Initiative. What do you think of that sort of approach to global direct democracy?
I'm not that aware of the mechanics of it. Can Joe explain how it works briefly?
Maybe also Daniela or Caroline can explain this very well.
I can also jump in here because my question kind of piggybacks on Joe's question. First of all, thanks for your presentation. I think a bottom-up approach to global issues is an idea that's really been picking up much more speed in the last years, probably thanks to globalization and the internet. So the World Citizens Initiative, I'm wondering first if you're familiar with the European Citizens Initiative, because this is right now, as you probably know, the only real transnational tool of participatory democracy that exists in the world. So there's a campaign that we as Democracy International, we're running with Democracy Without Borders and Civicus for a global version of this. So, at the EU level, it's 1 million signatures in 1 year across a minimum of 7 member states. This would then be a tool that, of course, expands those numbers, but also expands to the geographical area, so to the UN. So what do you think of this kind of approach, using already a tool that exists, that's been existing for over 8 years now, that's seen some success, and just what your thoughts on that are?
Well, I'd need to look at it in more detail, Daniela. Thanks for explaining. I mean, my question would be, does it engage people's votes? Because if it's just a signature on a piece of paper, as far as I'm concerned, I'm done with signatures. I'm done with protests. I'm done with, it's sort of a little bit like if you want a rabbit to jump, you've got to dangle a carrot. If you want a politician to jump, you've got to dangle a vote. And so any initiative that doesn't engage our right to vote is not, or is unlikely, in my view, to really cut the mustard. Politicians have got to know that their electoral fortunes depend on them doing what we need them to do. And petitions and protests and avars and all of this stuff, I'm not saying it's a waste of time, don't get me wrong, Daniel, and I'm not saying I wouldn't support it. I think we should support all of these things because we don't know what will work and what won't. But I'm skeptical in the sense that if it doesn't engage our right to vote, it may not get politicians to really commit to it as they need to commit to it. But I need to look into it in more detail.
Yeah, sure. And there's actually tomorrow at the same time at 6:30 p.m. tomorrow, a workshop just on this. But to kind of also follow up on that, so the World Citizens Initiative would basically be like a world petition platform. But the hook is that the UN General Assembly would then have to respond in one way or another, either than by writing. So, I mean, you say that the vote needs to be engaged. I mean, I guess you can say a signature is like a vote, but what about the question of follow-up? Because I think you need to have this requirement that there's some kind of follow-up, that citizens expect some kind of response from whoever is responsible in order to have this real tool. That's a little bit, that's the strength of the European Citizens Initiative compared to any other petition or a petition to the European Parliament, is that the European Commission has to respond in one way or another in writing to a successful European Citizens Initiative. Of course, they don't have to take it up, but they have to respond then, this is why we will not take up your issue. But there's still that visibility, and there's still that back and forth exchange. So what do you think more about that? If this feature of follow-up at the very end, is this something that you think is very important in your process, or not so important?
Well, yes, it would be, but can I just ask, the petition that people are signing, what does it ask politicians to do? What does it ask governments to do?
So this is just an idea, of course. It's just a campaign that hasn't been implemented yet, but it would be basically on any global, any topic that would affect, that the UN, of course, picks up. For example, it could be, I mean, as we're talking also in this workshop about climate change, would be like a perfect topic for a World Citizens Initiative. So it would say, you know, all countries in all UN member state countries would be required to sign the Paris Agreement, for example, just thinking off the top of my head.
Okay, but you see, I think my problem with that is that, you know, do we really think governments don't understand that there's a problem with the climate? Of course they understand it. Of course they know that there's a problem. The problem is not that they don't get it. The problem is that they're worried about their economic competitiveness. Okay, you know, so it seems to me that these petitioning is a little bit redundant, because it presumes that governments don't understand that there's a problem. Governments understand very well that there's a problem. What they don't, but they can't act because they need to keep their national economies competitive. You know, so it seems to me that we need to go deeper than just telling them what needs doing that they already know anyway. We've got to actually help them out of their problem. We've got to analyze why they're not acting, and then devise a framework that makes it in their interests to act, and put the power of our votes under their backsides as well. You know, so, I mean, again, I'm not saying that this is a bad idea, Daniela, or anything. I mean, I think it's, of course we should support it, but I'm just questioning whether really the days of petitions are, you know, or just telling governments there's a problem. They know there's a problem. The difficulty is that they don't know how to get out of the vicious circle of destructive global competition. That's the problem. You know, so I think we've got to be more clever and deeper about our analysis of what's going on here.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to add something, because what Daniela is talking about, the ECI, is actually not a petition tool. The key difference is that an ECI obligates the European Commission to take action. In this case, it obligates them to make a decision on a topic that is suggested by citizens, by 1 million citizens in the EU. And the World Citizens Initiative would work the same way. So it's not just a petition that asks, it does obligate concrete action to be taken afterwards. So it is a little bit different from just any online petition campaign. Okay. And of course, the stronger it gets, the better, but it is an official tool that is written in the European, in the Lisbon Treaty. So it is, it's very different to something, it obligates politicians to take action in very much in the same way as,
Well, I mean, I'd say, you know, definitely try it, and we should all support it, definitely. You know, I think, like I said earlier, I think we should support all of these things, because, you know, anything we can do to drive politicians towards the action that we need has got to be a good thing. But I do, you know, like I say, I do think we need to. I think that we tend to have this us and them idea, is that these politicians, they're all, you know, stupid, negligent, corrupt, evil people that just will not do what we want them to, you know, that won't do what's necessary. And the reality is, to my mind, yes, of course, there are some evil and corrupt politicians out there, for sure. But by and large, it seems to me, it's not that politicians don't want to solve these problems, it's that they can't. And so we need to help them. We need to analyze what it is that's preventing them from acting and trying to deliver to them a solution. So, but having, you know, like I said, we should do both. We should definitely do both. Any more questions? Dana?
Yeah, Dana, I have a
Yes.
John, I'm a little sorry. I came late in, and so I'm still struggling a little bit with the principal idea of the Simpol promise. So if a politician endorses somehow it's the idea is that somehow to have an oath to say, yes, I hereby come in this alignment of synchronizing myself to others, to other politicians, and you can measure myself by this. Is this a sort of a moral entanglement, or what is it? I'm still thinking about it, because, you know, but as you said, everybody says climate, we have an interesting person governing the United States, which has some example and some others. So, but somehow everybody agrees we need to do something against climate change. Everybody says, almost every leader of the world says we have to fight against child labor and so on. And you are really thinking hard how to solve this. But I didn't get, I'm really honest, I didn't get the essential clue. Maybe you can repeat it for a stupid German guy. I don't know.
I don't know, you Germans, what can we do? Daniel, yeah, so I suppose what I'm trying to do is to outline the principles of cooperation. How do you get, you know, I mean, you could say, if you imagine a group of boys at a school fighting over a packet of sandwiches, how do you transform that vicious circle from fighting for the sandwiches to cooperating to share the sandwiches? Okay, that's what Simpol is all about. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's what I meant about, you know, you need simultaneous implementation, you know, you need a multi-issue policy agenda so that what a nation loses on one policy, it can gain on another. In English, we say swings and roundabouts. So what you lose on the swings, you gain on the roundabouts. You need detailed policies that are agreed transnationally so that each nation knows what the other nations are committed to doing. And then you need citizens to just drive that whole process forward using the vote, which is the only language politicians really understand. So that's the principle of it, Daniel. And the pledge is something that politicians, political parties and governments are invited to sign. And as I say, it's a pledge in principle, committing them to implementing the simultaneous policy, subject to sufficient nations having signed and subject to the policies eventually being agreed. So it is, you know, it's a pledge in principle. But as I explained, it sounds very weak and a very low bar to jump, and deliberately so. But as support grows, and you can see by the domino effect, because you know how powerful that is, because we never tell politicians how many supporters we have in their area. We leave them guessing. you know. So we are applying maximum pressure.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
It's just that Heiko Erhard had like this same kind of question, like about the bad guys in the domino effect. You want to speak it out loud?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that, Dana. What was the question?
Heiko Erhard has a similar question, like Daniel Charlie.
Heiko, can you explain your question?
Oh, sure. I hope I'm raising not too many nasty questions. The Germans, you know. Okay, so coming back to the not so friendly people in this world. So I think this works really well if all players have a common goal or at least a common vision in mind. So, but what I'm asking myself, so what are the bad guys, the guys actually who like fighting and actually who intend to gain some particular unfair advantage? So, for example, by letting the other nations pay for fixing the climate, doing nothing, but still actually automatically also earning the benefits. So there might one know that, oh well, I'm actually doing nothing. I'm just sitting here. I know they need me actually to fulfill this. My country is big enough. So actually, without me, they're not gonna get their sufficient figure together.
Yeah.
So how to deal with these guys?
Okay. So first of all, if they're in a democratic country, these bad guys, I would say that the electoral process that I've discussed has the potential to overcome that. So even in the United States, for example, if you think back to the election in the year 2000 between Bush and Gore, it was hanging on just a few thousand votes in Florida, right? Now, if you imagine a time when we had maybe a few thousand Simpol supporters in Florida and in the key US states, both main candidates, both the Republican presidential candidate and the Democrat would have to sign up. They'd have no choice. If we hold that critical number, they would have no choice. If we're talking about a non-democratic country, ultimately we don't have that power, of course. But there are two things I would say. One is, when we talk about it today, Heiko, you know, it's absolutely, I understand what you're saying. But what we have to imagine is a time in the future when global problems are really up around our necks. Then it becomes in the interests even of the bad guys to cooperate. That's how cooperation has worked throughout the whole of evolution. And even if you had, I don't know, a minor non-democratic country that refused to cooperate, the remaining countries could probably work out some kind of arrangement to isolate that country from the agreement. So I think there would be ways around it, but you know, I think the main point is that unfortunately, humans being what they are, we only really take responsibility and cooperate when there's a crisis. And I don't think that global problems are going to be any different, sadly. Things will have to get worse before the evil guys realize that it's in their interests too. And I think also a lot of the guys that we regard as evil, what are they? They are just looking out for their economic competitiveness. Yeah. You know, they're not actually saying, well, some, you know, a lot of them are not saying we are, you know, we don't care. What they're saying is well, we do care, but we're worried about losing our competitiveness. You know, so and I think that's where Simpol has a huge advantage, because it's the only environmental or global justice campaign that has the capacity to appeal to people on the right, to parties on the right who care about economic competitiveness. Because Simpol completely obliterates that objection.
John, the thing is, if we are up to our necks in problems, it might be too late. This is my fear.
I agree. It might be, Heiko.
Yeah.
You know, and I agree. There are no guarantees here. But what Simpol is already doing is starting the ball rolling. You know, we've already got 100 MPs in the UK. We've already got MPs in Germany. You know, but we need citizens to get behind this. And I think one of the problems is that citizens, unfortunately, are becoming switched off politics. They're becoming switched off. And what we need to do is to bring them back.
One last thought, one idea. I mean, the whole thing might sell easier if you try to lower the entry barrier. So actually try to make them try out a system like Simpol by actually applying it to a comparatively easy use case. So they get used to it, so that they have the experience. This works. They can do an experiment with that. So they do not need to pledge for whatever there will be coming.
Yeah, no, I understand. We need to find a kind of pilot policy or a kind of
exactly
something like I don't know, a global holiday or something like that.
I mean, this is what we are doing here in Germany with our first Bürgerrat, or our first civil assembly on a federal level. So we are trying to make this an experience for politicians who basically have no idea what this is and what power it has. This is why we're doing the first thing. It's yet to be started in 2021.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a good idea, Daniel, and some people have suggested it before, but we've never really managed to find a policy idea that could somehow catch the imagination and yet still convey the message. So if you've got any ideas, then we'd certainly be pleased to think about them.
We'll be thinking about it.
I'm going to interrupt on this point, because there's there's a question from Nestor Lemos rating, and asking if this is like on the he asked this like a few minutes ago. So he asked the question like, how would it be this would be used in places like Iran, China, or Russia?
Okay. Well, I think I already answered that, is that in non-democratic countries, the answer there is that ultimately these countries need solutions to global problems as well.
But it was about countries who are like officially democratic.
Countries that are unofficially
officially democratic.
Oh, officially democratic, but not really democratic. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, well, the same thing applies. The point is that the framework of Simpol is such that there's nothing to lose for any country, democratic or not, to engage in the process. You know, whether they will or not depends on how critical global problems become.
So thank you for this answer. The time is running, so we have to end at this point. Thank you, John, for your presentation, for your time. It was really interesting. Thanks to all of you for all your questions, and yeah.
Well,
so
yeah, thank you, Dana, for moderating, and thank you, Democracy International, and thanks for everybody for taking the time to have a listen to this. And you know, if you've got further questions, please do get in touch on email, and we'll do our best to answer them. And please sign up, and please, you know, get involved.
Yeah, and It's 8 p.m. I think we're gonna close this Zoom. So enjoy your evening and come to the other workshops and panels.